I guess if nothing else, it's given me something to do while I wait to be old enough to be on 60 Minutes, you know?
A columnist described Bob Schieffer as the kind of guy you'd like to have dinner with, and maybe that's the primary reason why he's had such dramatic success at the dinner hour.
With Bob Schieffer.
First, the question of Nixon versus Johnson.
But there are other reasons, too, including a solid foundation in journalism that's taken him from cub reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram to face-to-face meetings with every president since Richard Nixon, who he questioned one Sunday morning on staff changes at the White House.
And I said, Mr. President, these advisors, are the new ones, are they going to be in-house advisors? And he said, oh, no, they'll be outhouse advisors.
Schieffer did not meet Nixon's 1960 rival, President John F. Kennedy, although it was on a fateful November 22nd in Dallas that he came upon one of the most memorable stories of his career. A story at the center of the drama that was gripping the nation.
It's not even taken off my hat, and I always wore a hat in those days because to show you how the mores and kind of the ethics of journalism have changed since then. In those days, we never told anybody who we were. If someone asked, we never lied, but if they wanted to assume we were detectives, we just let them believe that. I mean, I always say that our view of the First Amendment was that everyone has a right to talk to the Star-Telegram, even if they don't know they're talking to the Star-Telegram. And that's just the way we operated. So I still had my hat on. I answered the phone, and a woman said, is there anybody there who can take me to Dallas? And I said, well, lady, you know, we don't run a taxi service here, and besides, the president has been shot. And she said, well, yes, I heard it on the radio. I think my son is the one that they have arrested. And it was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. So I quickly forgot that part about we don't run a taxi service. I said, now, where do you live? And she told me, and I said, now, here's what I want you to do. I said, I want you to hang up that phone. And I said, for security reasons, I don't want you to answer it when it rings again. I said, you just let it ring. I'll be out there to get you. So we drove out to the west side of Fort Worth, and there standing on the curb was Marguerite Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. And I got in the back seat with her. Bill drove to Dallas, and I interviewed her, and it turned out to be the first interview, and it stood up for about a week or so before anybody else talked to her. And so that was kind of a real exclusive for me. But anyway, we get to the Dallas police station. Now, mind you, Fort Worth and Dallas are two very separate places, and nobody knew who I was in Dallas. So when I got there, I just walked up while Bill went to park the car. I walked up to the first uniformed policeman I could find, and I said, does anybody, I said, I'm the one that brought Oswald's mother over here. I said, is there any place we can put her so these reporters won't be bothering her? Well, you know, when you're 26, 27 years old, you do these things, you know. I guess I was probably about 25. That's about how old I was. And so anyway, the man actually found us a little office in the burglary squad and said, will this be all right? And I said, I think this will be fine. And the great thing about it was it had a phone in there, so I could go out in the hall, and all of you have seen those newsreels of how it looked in those days. It's total bedlam, and nobody had any place they could call in their stories. So I would go out. We had 16 reporters in the police station by that time, and I'd get up the stuff from them, gather it up, take it back, and phone it in to the paper where they were churning out these extras. So it was working pretty well for us, but still we had no idea what was going on. And finally, as I'd been there 4 or 5 hours, and darkness was coming, and Mrs. Oswald said to me, said, do you think they will let us talk to him? And I said, well, let me go find out. So I went and asked Captain Will Fritz, the chief of homicide. I said, you know, she'd really like to see her son. And he said, well, I think we can do that. So we were all herded into this little holding room off the jail, and they were about to bring him down to talk to his mother. And mind you, I'd been in the police station at least 5 hours, probably 6 or 7 hours, and at that point, not one single person had asked me who I was. Well, I'm thinking, my God, I'm going to get the exclusive of all exclusives here. You know, I'm going to talk to this man that's been charged with assassinating the president. We don't know what's going on. And finally, a guy standing there said, who are you? And I said, one thing I'd learned from the cops is you always, if you don't want to give an answer, just ask another question. And I said, well, who are you? And he said, are you a newspaper man? And I said, well, aren't you? And at that point, I got what I believe to be the first serious death threat that I ever received. He said, son, I want you to get out of here. And he said, if I ever see you again, he said, I don't mean today, I mean ever. He said, I'm going to kill you.
The story of Margarita Oswald, big and fortuitous though it was just a sidebar to Schieffer's political education, which came at the hands of a Texas legend, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Schieffer's a Texas boy himself, and no figure loomed larger than LBJ, who barnstormed the massive state in a helicopter and squeaked into a seat in the United States Senate.
He was elected by 87 votes out of millions of votes that had been cast. And the interesting thing about it is they did not find those 87 votes until a week after the election. The election was contested, and they found a precinct voting box that had been missing in Duval County. And in that voting box, they opened it up, and one of the interesting things about it, 200 people had voted in that precinct. And the really interesting thing about it, and you can look this up, it's true, all 200 had voted, according to the voting roll, all 200 had voted in alphabetical order. Really. Out of those 200 votes, they found 87 votes that gave Lyndon Johnson that victory. And that was the story of how he was elected and how he became known as Landslide Lyndon. But anyway,
we've once again installed a camera on the headset of Bob Schieffer.
The rough and tumble politics of the Lone Star State were a good breeding ground for the competitive instincts necessary to win in the broadcast news game. Those instincts came to the fore in Schieffer when his competitor at ABC, Barbara Walters, scored an exclusive interview with President Gerald Ford. Neither Schieffer nor his boss, Walter Cronkite, could let that stand.
I went to the press secretary and asked for an interview with the president, and he said absolutely not, under no circumstances. So then, seeing I was going to get nowhere with that, and I was trying to figure out what to do, well, of all things, Walter Cronkite called me on the phone, and he said, Bob, I understand the president's going up to Yonkers later in the day. Would you have any objection if I joined you on the campaign? Well, what was I going to say? No, Walter, we don't want you up here. We'll handle this fine. And I said, well, you know, of course, Walter, we'd love to see you up there. And how can I do? And he said, Bob, is there any chance that I could get an interview with the president? And I said, Walter, that is really going to be rough, but I said, let me see what I can do. Well, I went back to the press secretary, and this time he just sneered. So I decided there was nothing else to do. I went to the president's chief of staff. Very young fellow, he's 32 years old. In those days I called him Dick. These days I call him Mr. Vice President. And it was Dick Cheney. And I said, Dick, is there any way that Walter's coming up here? Is there any way that Walter could do an interview with the president? He said, Bob, we can't do that. He said, you know, we've promised Barbara Walters, and he said, I just can't do that. And I said, well, let me ask you this. Is there any way I could just get Walter in to say hello to the president? I said, I know that the president likes Walter Cronkite. And he said, well, yeah, I can do that. And I said, well, Dick, do you think there's any way that while he's doing that, I could have a camera crew come in with him? Just so, you know, we could kind of document it. It'd be a nice little souvenir for Walter. And he gave me that kind of crooked little smile that he has. Then he said, Bob, I am not going to authorize any interview. Now, we promised Barbara Walters, I'm just not going to authorize that. And I said, well, what about just getting the camera crew in there? What would you think about that? And he said, well, okay, I'll let you do that. But he said, I'm not authorizing any interview. And I said, okay. Well, there was a big story going around as to whether the president was going to take his flu shot, because they had just started giving flu shots, and a lot of people had become ill after taking them. They didn't know if they were really that safe. And so, you know, we were trying to find out, was the president going to set a good example and take his flu shot, or was he going to call off the whole program? So anyway, at the appointed time, Walter and the camera crew, was a three-man crew, the cameraman, one guy holding the lights, and one guy holding the microphone. So they're standing here, and Walter takes the microphone himself in his left hand, and I'll never forget it. I was right behind him. He has the microphone in his left hand. He walks in, shakes hands with the president, and said, hello, Mr. President, are you going to take your flu shot? Well, the president just laughed. He knew what was going on. He said, yes, Walter, I've decided that to set a good example, I am going to take the flu shot, and I think this is something that every American ought to do. Well, by this time, the press secretary was so incensed that he had literally grabbed the sound man around his waist and was trying to wrestle him to the ground. I mean, it was the biggest mess you've ever seen, and these people all tangled up with each other, and President Ford, who had a great sense of humor, just stood there, and he just thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen. But anyway, we were all hustled out of the room, and that night, here is how the CBS Evening News started. Good evening. President Ford told me in an exclusive interview today. And after that, we proceeded to play the entire interview, all 9 seconds of it. And this is a story that did not have old Bob's name on it in any place, but the one person who knew why and how it had come about was Walter Cronkite. And for a long time after that, I could do no wrong. In fact,
your trust is the greatest honor I could ever receive.
In his career at CBS, Schieffer became the only journalist to cover all 4 major Washington beats: State Department, Pentagon, Congress, and the White House, earning the professional respect of his peers and the public. But along the way, he's lost none of that Texas charm or spirit that have brought his pilgrimage to a rousing crescendo in its sunset days, sitting in the same chair that held Murrow and Cronkite, the chair that America once again welcomes to the dinner table.